What do you look for when choosing a new headphone amplifier? Is it specs and power output? If so, you might not be so keen on this amp. If your emphasis is more about sound quality and synergy with various headphones, the Nitsch Audio DSHA-3FN might be just the thing you're looking for. But interestingly, this isn't actually a new amplifier, at least not a new design. CT from Nitsch Audio didn't design this amp, he just resurrected it with a little bit of extra magic added. The DSHA-3FN is a slightly modified version of the DSHA-3F made by ECP Audio. That amp had a cult following thanks to its sense of control that it exerted over the drivers of the headphones. That and its very enjoyable tonal character and presentation. Some DSHA-3Fs still exist today, but in my experience you'll rarely see them come up on the second-hand market. It seems there might be good reason for that. Rather than waiting for a DSHA-3F to pop up on your favourite classifieds though, you could now go out and buy yourself a brand new Nitsch version, the 3FN. Let's talk about whether you should. The name DSHA-3FN is a little bit of a mouthful. That's because it's actually an acronym for the design of the amplifier. DSHA stands for Differential Stereo Headphone Amplifier. In normal speak, that means that the amplifier uses distinct circuits for the positive and the negative signal within each channel. In other words, you've got a right positive and a right negative circuit, and a left positive and a left negative circuit. One side of the circuit pushes the driver for the positive parts of the musical wave, and then the other part of the circuit pulls the driver for the negative parts of the musical wave. The idea of this is it creates greater control over the driver, but it also helps to cancel out any noise generated within the amplifier, such as from the power supply, because the same noise goes into both the positive and the negative side, and so when one side is pushing with power supply noise, the other side is pulling equivalently with the same noise, and they cancel each other out. It's a little bit like how the balance connections from your DAC to your amplifier work, only being done in the amplification stage, and so it's a touch different, but similar. Another thing this design does is it keeps the left and right channels completely separate, and that means you're not going to get the problem of crosstalk. Crosstalk is when a little bit of the sound from the right bleeds into the left, and a little bit of the sound from the left bleeds into the right. By removing that bleeding of sound, we get better imaging, we get better separation of the channels, and a wider, clearer soundstage. And so that's what all the DSHA bit of the name is. Then we get to the 3FN. The 3FN acknowledges three things. The number 3 tells us that this is the third generation of the DSHA design. The F refers to the fact that when the original was designed, it was optimized for focal headphones. Don't be put off though if you've got any other brand of headphone. I'll talk about all the different pairings that I've tried with this and how it sounded in a moment, and quick spoiler alert, it's going to sound great with other brands too. Finally, the N in the name tells us that this is the Nitsch Audio version. Basically, CT from Nitsch Audio licensed the design of the DSHA from Doug at ECP Audio, who used to make them. From there, CT's made a few little tweaks of his own. Firstly, the 3FN is a smaller amplifier. It's going to take up less space on your desk. It also has an RCA input, whereas the original was XLR only. And then finally, I believe the transformers used in the new version are a little bit different from the ones in the old version, and that's going to be partly due to availability and also potentially partly due to new advances in technology. But what's being used in the DSHA-3FN is still the same concept, just improved. So they're using high-quality cobalt transformers made by Lundahl, one of the best makers of transformers in the world, and those transformers take the place of capacitors in the audio circuit. The idea of that is to maintain the purity and the transparency of the signal coming through the amplifier. All of this results in an amplifier that retails for $2,850 US, and it might just be one of the most unique amps on the market today, perhaps alongside an amp like the Schiit Mjolnir 3, because that uses chokes and things like that, which are a bit unusual too. All this is lovely theory though. Let's talk now about how the DSHA-3FN actually performs. This video is sponsored by Deconi Audio, makers of headphone pads, ear tips, a fantastic modular cable system, and even things like headphone carry cases. Visit deconiaudio.com and use the code PassionForSound10 for 10% off any purchases of all their range of products. I mentioned before that the original DSHA-3F was optimized for focal headphones. Realistically though, it's going to suit pretty much any headphone on the market, except maybe Hyphaman Susvara, the original, Hyphaman HE6SE, Abyss 1266, and Modhas Tungstens. And I'm not being definitive there because I don't have any of those headphones here to test with the DSHA-3FN, and it's quite possible that if you're not a particularly loud listener and you don't use lots of EQ, the DSHA-3FN might actually still work for those headphones. Why am I being vague about this? Firstly, because I always like to hear something before I make any conclusions about its sound quality. Secondly, because the power output of the DSHA-3FN is a little bit hard to grapple with. Its power output can vary depending on the headphones you plug into it and the DAC that it's connected to as well. I'll explain a bit more about why that is. The 3FN uses a type of volume control known as a shunt volume control. Essentially, as you adjust the beautiful gold volume knob here, what it's doing is actually bleeding some of the voltage off the signal. Rather than placing the volume control in the actual signal path, what the design of the DSHA does is place it off to the side a little bit like a pressure release valve. And so the signal never passes through the volume control, and that's going to be good for improving the transparency of the signal, making sure that there's nothing getting in the way of that signal path, but it still allows us to have full volume control. It just bleeds a bit of it away. There is one drawback to that design though, and that is that it actually changes the impedance of the circuit. And that's what I was saying before about the exact power output being a little bit hard to grapple with. Depending on the position of the volume control on the DSHA, the overall impedance of the circuit inside is going to change. That's going to alter the amount of signal that comes from your DAC into the amplifier. And then on top of that, we've got an output impedance of 4.9 ohms. And what that means is that the way the amp then transfers the power into your headphones is also a bit variable depending on the impedance of the headphones. If you just found your eyes glazing over as I went into all that technobabble, let me simplify things. The DSHA-3FN does some tricky stuff to make it sound better. And it has no impact on the 3FN's ability to drive pretty much all the headphones around, except those few I listed before, perhaps. It's worth keeping in mind here that most headphones don't need any more than about 100 milliwatts of amplifier power. Some do, but not most. The 3FN has significantly more power than that at most impedances. At around about 50 ohms, I think it was, it's got about 330 milliwatts. Roughly speaking. What's going to be the most important part of producing great sound though is having a very transparent amplifier, one that doesn't muck up the signal coming in before it gets out to your headphones. Another thing that's going to help is having great control and precision, or some people might call it the grip that the headphone amplifier exerts on the actual headphone drivers. These are all things that the 3FN does. And sometimes more powerful amplifiers do it too. That's one reason that a more powerful amp might sound better, is because it might have better control over the drivers. But the specific design of the 3F does that too, even though it's not immensely powerful. This is not a 10-watt headphone amplifier, but it's an incredibly well-controlled one. And one way that that translates, and you hear it when you listen to the DSHA-3FN, is the sense of space that it produces around individual sounds and notes and instruments. The 3FN doesn't produce a massive soundstage, but it defines every sound beautifully in space with lots of room around each sound so each instrument has space to breathe. And that's true whether I'm listening from the Focal Utopias, the Audeze LCD5s, or the ZMF Atriums. In other words, a mid-impedance dynamic driver headphone, a low-impedance planar magnetic headphone, and a high-impedance dynamic driver headphone. It really doesn't matter what you plug into this, except maybe those few I mentioned before. The DSHA-3FN sounds fantastic with everything. Even on the somewhat difficult to drive headphone 2, the DSHA-3FN sounded great and was plenty loud enough without ever getting close to the 50% on the volume pot. And that's not that the volume pot is necessarily a good indication of power output, because it's not, but the combination of sound quality and the position of the volume knob gives us a general indication of how hard the amplifier is working. And all I can say is that with every single headphone I have here that I've tried, which is probably at least half a dozen headphones, the DSHA-3FN sounded great. And they were as vast a range of headphones as I could find. As I said, mid-impedance dynamics, mid-impedance planars, high-impedance dynamics, low-impedance planars, and everything in between, including the AMT drivers of the headphone too. And so now that we know that it works with every possible type of headphone, the next question is, how does it sound? And the answer is that it's a little bit warm and a little bit rich, but not at all thick sounding. The 3FN is one of the few solid-state amps that I've heard where I actually agree with the marketing saying that it's a bit tube-like. Often, calling a solid-state amp tube-like is just a marketing buzzword. Here, it's the real thing. There's a sense of naturalness and liquidity to the sound of the DSHA-3FN that's very much normally a tube characteristic. And then to add to that, it has a wonderful sense of attack and articulation thanks to the level of control that it exerts over the drivers. In other words, I've said that it's a little bit rich, but don't think it lacks energy and liveliness, because it definitely doesn't. What it lacks is just any undue sense of aggression or harshness or edginess. It delivers the whole frequency range beautifully, and it's just a joy to listen to as a result. Before we get into some detailed comparisons, let's quickly talk about the different inputs. I mentioned before that on the new version, the 3FN here, there are two different options. You've got RCA and XLR with a switch to toggle between them. Comparing the RCA and the XLR outputs would suggest to me that maybe the RCA isn't quite as perfectly transparent as the XLR inputs are, and that means that they might be just a tiny bit less resolving. But it's a very close call, and because I had to do some volume matching in between each of the switches because of the higher voltage from XLR compared to RCA, it was very hard to directly compare them apples to apples. And so that's why I'm being a little bit vague here. I think the XLR is slightly preferable, but it's not enough of a difference to get hung up on. And while we're talking about balanced and unbalanced connections, there's something very important you need to know if you're going to use a DSHA-3FN. And that is that you should never use an adapter to change the output from this one into some sort of single-ended connection. In other words, a 4-pin XLR to a 6.3mm adapter. Those are available, but if you use them with the DSHA-3FN, you will blow up the amplifier. And that's because the circuit is set up with that specific push and pull design. If you start adapting from 4-pin XLR down to some sort of unbalanced connection, you're going to be short-circuiting some of those circuits, and things are going to get ugly. And so with that public service announcement out of the way, let's get into some comparisons. There are a few amps that seemed logical as comparisons with the DSHA-3FN. The first is the LAiV HP2A headphone amp and preamp. The HP2A delivers quite a similar sound to the 3FN, but it's not quite as easygoing sounding as the 3FN, not quite as liquid or smooth. The sound has a tiny bit more detail from the HP2A, but it also sounds a bit drier. I'd struggle to say that either amp is better or worse. They're just different. The HP2A produces a more open sound overall, a slightly larger soundstage, and as I said, it's got slightly more resolution and texture. On the other hand, the DSHA-3FN is a little bit more intimate, but it also envelops you more in the sound as a result. The 3FN is an amplifier that's going to let you just get lost in the music, even if it's not quite as technical sounding as the HP2A. It's worth noting that the HP2A is much more powerful. It's also a preamp if that matters, and it's got some extra inputs available via an external optional module. And so in other words, it really depends on what you're looking for here. Both are fantastic amps and you can't really go wrong. It's just about matching it to your needs and your preferences. Next up, for the sake of pure curiosity, I decided to compare the DSHA-3FN with the vastly more expensive Burson Soloist Voyager. This is $2,850 versus $4,799, but what the heck? As expected, based on everything I've already said, the DSHA presents a sound which is a bit more rich through the mid-range. The Voyager is a little bit more resolving, a little bit crisper, and a little bit more open sounding. Like the LAiV HP2A, the Voyager produces a bit more space overall, and technically speaking, the Voyager is clearly more technically capable, as it should be for the price. However, the DSHA actually gets incredibly close for the money. Some of those design decisions to maximize transparency are really paying off here, I think. The DSHA is also a smoother listen, and that's going to be preferable to some people on brighter headphones. For example, if you've got any of the Hyphaman models and you find them to be just a little bit bright at the top end, the DSHA-3FN is going to be a wonderful match. Again, maybe not for the Susvara, the original Susvara and the HE6 SE, but for every other model, including the latest unveiled models, the DSHA is a lovely pairing. That might sound like I'm saying the Voyager is harsh in comparison to the DSHA, which it's not. The Voyager is also a very well refined amplifier, again as you'd expect for the price. But the DSHA is even more easy to listen to again. And easy to listen to is not a polite way of saying thick, slushy or muddy, it's just that it's not aggressive or harsh. As I said before, you can lose yourself in the sound of the 3FN. And there's also a sense of naturalness that comes with the design of the 3FN that I think is very enjoyable too, perhaps preferable in some ways over the very, very processed signal that comes out of the Voyager. And I don't mean that as a knock, it's just that it has got a lot more going on in the signal path. None of this is to say that I would choose the DSHA over the Voyager. The Voyager is clearly the superior amplifier, as it should be for the price. But you can hear that the Voyager is sort of doing more things to the signal. There's a sense of purity that comes with the DSHA sound. The Voyager is more transparent in terms of the fine details and the resolution that it brings, but it's less transparent in the sense that the music sounds more untouched by the DSHA. The DSHA sounds more like it's just letting the music pass through in that wonderfully liquid and flowing way. As you can probably tell, this is a hard one to explain. Something else that I noticed about both of these amps is that they both have that wonderful sense of control over the drivers, a wonderful sense of articulation and feel. And yet, the Soloist Voyager is vastly more powerful. So, as I said before, it's not about power, it's about how the amplifier controls those drivers. The energy of any note, whether it's a plucked string or a drum hit, is crisp, it's clean, and it's energetic from both amplifiers. And in fact, the DSHA-3FN might be even better than the Voyager on that particular characteristic. Despite the massive price difference here, I can absolutely see some people choosing the DSHA-3FN over the Voyager. It's not quite the choice I would make, but I can absolutely see some people doing it. And that brings us now to the final comparison. I said before that there is a certain tubiness to the sound of the DSHA, so I thought it was worth putting it up against a great tube amp. The Linear Tube Audio Velo amp that I have there has been upgraded with Ray tubes, specifically the 12AT7 Select tubes and the 6SN7 Reserve tubes. As a package, the total cost of that amplifier and tubes is probably approaching the cost of the DSHA-3FN. Putting these two marvellously enjoyable amps side by side, the Velo produces a bit more sense of emphasis through the mid-range compared to the DSHA, and that means it puts a bit more emphasis also into the center of the soundstage. It focuses the central image more and makes it a bit weightier, a bit thicker, a bit more solid perhaps. That results in a slightly more holographic central image from the Velo amp, but that's not to say that everything is a one-sided win for the Velo. The DSHA is a little bit drier sounding, or perhaps a better term is that it's a little bit less rich sounding, and it's also more resolving than the Velo. The DSHA is basically combining the best of tubes and the best of solid state here. It's rich and it's smooth, whilst also being very transparent and resolving. I would probably choose the Velo for a more relaxed listening session, or to go with brighter headphones. The DSHA would be my choice if the headphones were already a little bit warmer, or if I wanted more details and textures in that listening session. And you might be remembering at this point that I said similar things about the HP2A from LAiV and the DSHA when I compared them. In that case, it was the HP2A that was a little bit drier and a little bit more resolving. And to be clear here, the DSHA sits closer to the Velo than it does to the HP2A and the Voyager for that matter. If the HP2A is here, in terms of dry, textured, etc., not that it's a dry amp, but comparatively, if it's here and the Velo is here, the DSHA is here. And that makes the DSHA a wonderfully enjoyable headphone amp. It's a brilliant balance of musicality, enjoyment, and engagement without sacrificing technicalities. It's transparent and technically capable thanks to a very well thought out design and the control that it's able to exert on the headphone drivers. If you want a single amp to be both musically enjoyable and technically capable, this could be it. And you can check it out as always via the link in the description down below. Of course, if you feel like you need an amplifier that's even more powerful and that maybe has a little bit more emphasis on the technical performance of things, then I've pinned my review of the LAiV HP2A headphone amp here at the end. So watch that one next and maybe it'll help you make up your mind. For now though, as always, I want to send a huge thanks to YouTube channel members, also to channel Patreon members, and to those of you who leave super thanks on videos like this one. Until next time, happy listening, be kind to each other, and I'll see you here again soon on Passion for Sound.